Hence, within the relationship of estranged labour, each man views the other in accordance with the standard and the relationship in which he finds himself as a worker. There's a great deal going on in this passage, as there was indeed in the other passage. And again, if one allows that Marx is using a particular language here, I don't think the concept of man is terribly important here. I think we can read it, we can understand it as men and women. Let me try and offer then a slightly more formal explanation of what I think Marx is doing in this passage and how that links us back to work, alienation, species being, sense. The process of work as an expression of species being requires us to go beyond any idea of things produced, to grasp what Marx calls a relationship in which man or woman stands to other men or women. There's a German word here, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. It's translated in the copy I was using as the word confront. The sense is that one person confronts another person. I think this might be a mistranslation. I think this distorts the sense of the passage. I think we might get the sense of what Marx is talking about here. If we might get the sense of it if we go to the root meaning of the word, at least in German, that Marx uses, and that is facing. One person facing another person, smoking, eating, drinking, talking. This is the associational relationship between human beings. And confront, in this sense, perhaps suggests hostility, which is not there, I think, within Marx's description of what is taking place in association. Thus, we get the clearer sense, I think, if we see this as the face-to-face with others, not with the other, with others, face-to-face amongst and with others. If we follow that sense through this passage, I think we get this clearer understanding, if you like, takes us back to species being, of one person coming before another person in conversation, appearing before, coming before in the English. This sense of coming before is, of course, physical. I am before you now in that you are before me. But this links, I think, as well, and I'm going to have to be really careful here because I think this is quite a difficult idea. I think it's an idea there in Hegel. I think Marx is doing something much more interesting with it than Hegel was doing. And again, if you know the phenomenology, we know that subjectivity is it's a reciprocal relationship. I recognize you as you recognize me. That's what we are. We are mutual recognition. We come before each other. That can only take place if we are before each other. I recognize you, you recognize me. Our recognition, it'd be interesting to relate this back to slavery, which Mark was talking about earlier, because obviously one of the points of reference here is the master-slave dialectic. In some ways a misreading of Hegel, because I think to understand that idea of reciprocity in Hegel, it takes us to ethical life. That's another digression. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that this idea of association, in Hegelian terms, an idea of reciprocity, is not, that idea is there in Marx, but Marx is doing something, I think, distinct and different with this. What he's really saying, I think, is that Hegel gives us the abstract, philosophical account. What Marx is interested in, and the struggle between Marx and Hegel in the Paris manuscripts is this struggle, is that this is in the end a philosophical language, an abstract language. Remember the sun shining off the work-hardened bodies of the workers. That's not really a philosophical language. It's a descriptive language, a literary language. I'm not sure if I want to use that term. It's a sensuous description of the world, something happening now. Something that, in a sense, cannot be abstracted from because it's now. But at the same time, we have to abstract from it. There's the world and the account of the world. Marx is, in a sense, I think, trying to root this idea of species being, of the way in which we recognize each other, within really the myriad forms of social life in which this happens. And to anticipate, in a sense, my conclusion here, if there is an account of ethical life in Marx, if that account of ethical life is to be read into the critique of political philosophy, it produces a very, in some ways, different Marx, because the realization of ethical life, and let's give it a shorthand term, let's call it socialism or communism. Let's say as a shorthand. Yes, I know that this is difficult, perhaps even unlicensed, but let's just accept it for sake of argument at this point in time, it is now. If there is an account of ethical life in Marx, we could call it socialism or communism. It's not that of Hegel. It's rooted in concrete practices from which, whilst we must abstract, we shouldn't abstract. What I think I'm hinting at here and can't possibly elaborate is that that account of ethical life requires us to read Marx in a much more subtle way, and to see in moments of association, to see in those moments when people meet together, disgruntled workers, the universalist oppositionists of Marx discourse, to find in those peculiar, different, local, complicated meetings between people the beginnings, the articulations in practice, the nobility of the workers in the description that I read out earlier, it's a practice, it's what people do. It's how they perform their ethical life. It's in those activities that we might be able to find again, some way of talking about communism or socialism as taking place in the meeting together of people who meet together in a sense in the name of communism or socialism. That's to, I'm afraid, hint at in some ways, in quite a sketchy way, at the point that I want to get to at the end of this paper. I'm aware that there's a great deal, if you like, of philosophical discussion that would have to go into those points to exemplify them in a proper way. But I think it's important to do both in a way, and I think probably the forum that we're in at the moment would possibly not lend itself to me reading, massive amounts of text out, given that it's kind of quite complicated. So I want to try and, as I say, constantly return to the main thing that I want to try and say, and then in the time that I have left to try and focus in on some points of the 1844 manuscript where I think Marx is elaborating this argument, or giving us clues as to how we might elaborate it. So the next thing that I want to talk about is on page 6 of the manuscript, second paragraph from the top, is to try and give us a little more of a proper sense of what I might mean by ethical life, because that's clearly a main term in this argument. And I'm not trying to say that Marx explicitly, directly and deliberately starts using the Hegelian concept. He doesn't. And I think that's almost the problem. It's the problem in a sense, to connect it to perhaps other discussions of Marx that we may or may not have time to engage in. It's in a sense an argument around Marx's account of subjectivity. Yes, so it could be linked to that. But I just want to focus for the moment on the way in which, not just me, but other commentators are drawing our attention to almost like, I don't know, a missed opportunity where Marx stumbles upon this Hegelian concept, tries to use it, I think arguably does use it in the Paris manuscript, and then it kind of comes out of focus. I'm not saying he forgets it, but it slides out of focus. Strangely enough, if you reread Capital, if you reread the first chapter of Capital, there's a footnote where the passage that I read out a moment ago about recognition is rather cleverly and wittily linked to the commodity. So this work, I don't think that Marx ever truly stops thinking about it. I think it moves to the side of his main concerns, which, as I say, to me, I'm not sure if I can persuade you of this, but to me the progressive, the radical, the Marxist attempt to talk in terms of law and the state is to try and recover some idea of a critical principle which I'm linking to ethical life as a realization of socialism or communism, to try and recover this critical principle, which can then allow one to think, okay, in a philosophical sense, but I guess the other part of my argument is it would also take us to what people, workers, are themselves doing. That's where you find it. That's, to me, Marx's deconstruction of philosophy. That, to me, is Marx's reading of Hegel. It's too abstract. We need to abstract, we need an account of it, but that account must start with what people are doing, with practices, with the sensuous, with the material. So it's bound up, I think, in all these concerns around Marx's work and how Marx's work is to be read. But let me just, again, return to my text here in an attempt to give this admittedly rather sketchy argument, kind of hints and suggestions, to try and give it some more focused and proper sense. So this is the paragraph on page 6, second paragraph from the top if you have the manuscript. In the phenomenology, which is of course the main target of Marx's critique in the Paris Notebooks, Hegel's concept, Hegel works with the concept of cyclicite, ethical life. Or, how would we explain that? A sense of sense as contextual, relational, social, historical, and ultimately for Hegel, in a different sense, Marx, ethical. The analysis of, again, another Hegelian expression, being for oneself in the other. Yes, it doesn't sound good in English. I've no idea how it sounds in Turkish. It might sound better in German. Being for oneself in the other, which is, of course, the concern of the previous passage we were thinking about what I'm calling the face-to-face. Being for oneself in the other. I recognise you, you recognise me. It's that kind of, I don't know, reciprocity, dialectic of recognition. This analysis, then, of being for oneself in the other, I think both in Hegel and in a different sense in Marx, it must be understood within this sense of ethical life, how we recognise each other. However, cyclicite in Hegel is clearly a very, very complicated concept. I'm just trying to get at its crude outline. One could spend a great deal of time thinking about what this term means, even just in Hegel. Suffice to say that as far as Hegel is concerned, the concept is essential for thinking about the relationship between law, morality, and politics, and their changing historical and institutional forms. Whilst Marx does not mention the term ethical life or cyclicite as such in the Paris Notebooks, it is as if the concept ghosts his analysis. It's as if he can't leave it behind. It's always there in a complex sense. Moreover, ethical life can also be linked to a major theme in Hegel, and this is a theme about philosophy. This is the idea in Hegel of philosophy as a recognizing or a seeing again. A seeing again, a recognizing, of what was misunderstood or not properly recognized for what it is. This, for Hegel, is what philosophy does. It's why philosophy is important for Hegel. We misrecognize things, and then thinking correctly, thinking philosophically, we recognize them for what they are. To coin a metaphor, we might say that for Hegel, sense or meaning is textured. It has layers or movements that build and interact with each other, which only ultimately makes sense from the point of view of the absolute, of spirit or mind, reason if you like, in its most developed form. This is how we see things clearly for Hegel, obviously. Marx, of course, objects to a great deal of Hegel's thinking, especially this theme of abstraction. And the third manuscript in Paris Notebook is, of course, a critique of Hegel's concept of absolute mind, the absolute. However, despite making the critique of the absolute, in the Paris manuscript, it's as if Marx leaves in place the possibility of some idea of ethical life. I think one of the ideas that Marx takes from Hegel and changes is the idea exactly of philosophy as recognition, as an understanding, a proper understanding of what is. Obviously, though, by the light of Marx's own argument, we have a problem with Hegelian abstraction. Yes, it misses, I'm putting this crudely, the material. It misses, can't conceive of, sensuous practices. It turns the world of sense into the world of nonsense. This is the critique of Hegel in the Paris Notebook. The rich, textured world that Hegel is trying to get at, by virtue of Hegel's philosophical method, which abstracts, that world of sense is left behind. It's as if all Hegel has is a developed set of abstractions which miss the material, which miss the world in which people work, which miss the world in which sense comes into being through our association with each other. So essentially I'm drawing here on the thinking of Julian Rose, one of the great Hegelian Marxist thinkers, and a woman who sadly to some extent is forgotten. She died tragically young. A woman whose work is truly worth reading. So this is actually an idea from Julian Rose that I just want to elaborate a little bit here. So the argument that there is this lacuna, this failure, absence in Marxist thinking, for Rose is one of the major problems in Marxist critical philosophy. This, for Rose, is why, in a complex sense, the critique of political economy in Marx miscarries. So this is the point that I want to try and stress. Rose accuses Marx of actually misunderstanding an important element in Hegel's thinking. This is a quote from Julian Rose. Quote, "Philosophical meaning is gradually acquired through contradictory experiences." I'll read that again. Philosophical meaning is gradually acquired through contradictory experiences. This can be seen clearly, I think, if we look at the German word that Hegel uses, which is, I think, again, forgive my pronunciation, anerkennen, which actually echoes in the north of England is a slang word to ken, which is to know. So there's weird echoes here in Julian Rose's explanation. This word suggests that, quote, "an initial experience which is misunderstood and must therefore be re-experienced philosophically." And it's this idea, then, of experience, or moreover of re-experiencing, to use Rose's term, that for Rose, and I think this is to me a incredibly interesting way of reading Marx, it's this re-experiencing of experience through a kind of philosophy, through a philosophy that is engaged with practices in the world that orientates us, that gives us the basic orientating terms of an account of ethical life that we could find in Marx. I want to skip in terms of the paper here to just try and again sketch out, and it's going to be quite crude, but I want to just try and sketch out how these philosophical themes then link to Marx's reading of Adam Smith. So if you're on the manuscript, this is the just under the Roman numeral 5. It's the paragraph about in the middle of the paper there. So I'm going to read probably a couple of paragraphs, and then hopefully they'll all make sense. How much time do I have left?
5 or 10.
Okay, yeah, no, I'll be, and I can keep to time on this because this is really very, very patient, and I know it must be very difficult either listening to my bizarre accent from Northern England, if you are in English, but most people in England can't understand what I'm saying most of the time. So I want to try and keep to time. Whether you're listening to me in English or in Turkish, I'm sure it's very, very demanding for the translators and viewers and audience. So I want to try and conclude on time. And just try and, as I say, I'm moving really now towards the last 5 minutes or so of what I want to say. So this is the concluding element of the argument. And I think I might just read it out, if that's okay. So, I guess the rather clever point here is I was trying to, I don't know if you've ever seen the actual, what the Paris manuscripts look like, but they're not linear. It's not like a book. It's almost like Marx was writing columns, and then he was writing on bits of paper and gluing them on to the margins of the book. So it's a remarkably peculiar artifact, if nothing else. And it's unfinished. It begs, obviously, the question of how one actually reads it. It's not a conventional book. Marx is departing from Hegelian abstraction. He's not interested in the absolute. He's not really interested in Hegel's Odyssey of the Spirit. What he's interested in is political economy, work, capital, money, these terms. So Marx wants to hang on to, I think, in its reading both of Smith and Hegel, of what this material world is, this real world which we are in. The sense, the meaning of the meaningless world in which we are in is in part to do with our engagement with conditions of work under capitalism, which are and can be completely and utterly meaningless. So Marx's concern with this idea, I think, of sensuous practice, of ethical life lying in what workers do, is bound on this, is linked, this ultimate idea that it's there now. We are doing it. We're trying to make sense of it. Once we associate together as communists or as socialists, that is what we are doing. But we are doing that within the circumstances in which we are doing it. And if one abstracts, if one goes, if you like, to the way in which Marx's understanding of history tends to be used, that seems to me to collapse back into Hegelian abstraction. In other words, the meaning, because he does talk about the meaning of communism as a solution to the riddle of history, that is here and now. It's not to come. It's not been and gone. It's here and now, in the circumstances in which we find ourselves here and now, which is exactly why he needs to read Adam Smith, which is exactly why he needs to talk about wages, how wages work within an economy, and how the meaning of a worker's life is linked not just simply to wages. This is a way into a very complicated argument. But this is the meeting point, in a sense, of the engagement with political economy and the sense in which Marx is still struggling to articulate how a notion of ethical life might work. So, consider these arguments in the light of the first manuscript, which concerns wages, profit, and rent. So these are the terms that Marx is going to work with, and clearly it works within capital. Not the Odyssey of the Spirit, not the French Revolution, not classical civilization, all the things that were important to Hegel, but the terms of political economy, the sense that political economy attempts to make of the world, the sense that capitalism mandates, if you like. And the way in which Marx begins this analysis is to take wages, profit, and rent. I think these terms replace the Hegelian thematic of the family, law, civil society, and the state. Which is not to say you can't think about these terms, it's to say that one has to appropriate thinking about the family, law, civil society, and the state from the point of view of political economy. Now, where does one cut in? That's an incredibly complicated question, which I'm going to leave to one side, because clearly in the Paris manuscripts, it's done, as I've said, through this concern with wages, profit, and rent. To begin with the concept of wages, and I think I'll probably just talk about wages, is to focus on an aspect of the phenomena of work, clearly. Central, ultimately, if you go back to the argument about species being, in sense. Marx begins the analysis of wages in Smith's work with the, quote, antagonistic struggle between capitalist and worker. Now, I think one of the problems is here, and again, by the lights of Marx's own argument, these figures risk, the capitalist, the worker, becoming allegorical abstractions, not related to particular ways in which material life is lived and the struggle takes place, which is clearly what Marx is getting at. But he's using a kind of shorthand, which I think is borrowed in some senses from Hegel. In other words, the thinking of ethical life for Marx, and one can think of the way in which one understands ethics in a general sense, ethical teaching, ethical understandings often use allegorical figures. And I think it's in this sense that the worker and the capitalist appear at this point in the manuscript. They are allegorical figures, because by the light of Marx's main argument here, to understand the material terms of life, we have to descend to the material world. We have to be in the material world, where those abstractions of worker and capitalist make very particular sense within very particular practices. I'm not saying that they're irrelevant, but they are clearly abstractions. And the point is to make sense of those abstractions within whatever practices one is engaged, one is politically engaged. I think that's the sense in which I can make of these things. Let me try and then move towards the final thing that I wanted to say here. And it takes me back, again, to a rather, I'm afraid, abstract point, and one that perhaps could allow at least one understanding of what I'm trying to do with this thing. And this is page 13 of the manuscript, if you have it. One of the problems I found practically in trying to produce, let's call it, for want of a better word, a Marxist account of law, is to work at the level of jurisprudence, which is obviously to work already at the level of a philosophy of law, not legal practice, not what people are doing in opposing the law or resisting the law or demonstrating or what have you. That's not unimportant, but it's not philosophy. That's a practice, it could become the basis of an articulation, but that's not my concern. My concern is, in a sense, with abstraction, or rather within the way in which a particular moment of Anglophone jurisprudence, and I'm thinking of, again, I'm not sure who is reading this stuff outside of Oxford and Cambridge, the work of Joseph Raz. So again, if you have your point of reference, Raz is the successor of Hart. Okay, so if you like, hegemonic, dominant voice within jurisprudence is that of a form of positivism. Hart is the normal point of reference. Hart really can't now be understood without the work of Joseph Raz, who is a phenomenally subtle and complicated thinker. What he's doing, though, crudely, is providing a defense of law within capitalism, liberal culture. He realizes, I can't help thinking, that one needs a rigorous intellectual defense of law, which is in part, if you read a book like The Morality of Freedom, a defense of liberal culture. In other words, the target of a Marxist jurisprudence is precisely there. For Raz, this idea is thought philosophically through an Aristotelian question, the question of the good life. What does it mean to live well? And again, in extremely crude summary form, for Raz, he's cleverer than this, but the argument would be something like, living well is living within liberal capitalism. That's the answer to the question of the good life, which is clearly not the right answer. From my point of view, I would suggest perhaps our point of view as well. In other words, how can we take on the question of the good life, which the liberals now are using to defend liberal law at this jurisprudential level? My argument would be that is precisely why we need a Marxist version of ethical life. To say, and this will be my final sentence, the good life, living well, is socialism. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Mark and Adam on behalf of the audience. When you are preparing your questions, I have a couple of announcements to make, and they are going to be in Turkish. Değerli konuklar, hızlıca bir iki şey söylemek istiyorum. Bu toplantıyı ya emek koyan çok sayıdaki insandan naçizane biri olarak geçen yıla göre bu yıl yapıda ve formda bir takım değişiklikler yaptık. Gelecek yıl bunu da daha geliştirmeyi çok arzu ediyoruz. Gözünüze çarpan önereceğiniz değişiklik ve önerileri herhangi birimize iletmenizi dileriz. Bu birincisi. İkincisi, Sorular ve soru ve tartışmalardan sonra Taner'in ailesi sağ olsunlar hep yaparlar bunu. Bize tatlı ve börek göndermişler. Bir sonraki bu oturumun sonunda çay içerken Taner'in ruhuna gelenleri yiyeceğiz. Onu duyurmak görevi bana düştü. Taner'i özlemeye devam ediyoruz. Bu bölümü çok kısa tutacağım. Soru için mikrofonu alanlar lütfen çok kısa sorabilirlerse daha çok soru duyma şansımız olur. Bu konuda hassasiyet göstereceğinize çok eminim. Bir arkadaşım mikrofonu dolaştırabilir mi soru sormak isteyenlere ilişkin? Hacı sen